progress of the work. And we put together a slide lecture, and I put together the slide lecture. When I left my partnership, my ex-partner asked if he could borrow them to make copies, and he never gave them back. And if you guys want to try to get a hold of him and see if he'd be willing to donate, I don't think he ever.
At the Historical Society, we've got a collection of slides.
Yeah, but I don't know if are they ones that we took. Did he ever donate them? I don't think he did. Maybe.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of negatives I scanned recently, like 100.
Well, maybe he did donate them.
Yeah.
Don't you remember how?
Because back then, I remember he was the fellow was having a hard
I'm
time.
going there this afternoon.
What's his name?
Wesley Sessa.
And where's he at these
It's
days?
18th Century Restorations. I think he has a web page. Not sure of his phone number, but it's 18th Century Restorations. We were the company that did the restoration.
Okay.
I did it, but it was our company that did the restoration.
And your company is from where?
Me now, it's just me. I'm from Glenmore.
Okay.
Let's start with the very beginning. First off, you mentioned the people here from the Historic Commission. I was on the Historic Commission back in the day. It was Jane Davidson and Eda Brown and Lane Hurt and Phil, I don't remember Phil's last name, and Dick Radcliffe. And before the bicentennial, when the wagon train was coming and they were going to camp here in the park on the way to Valley Forge, Dick and I spent many a night and weekend reinforcing the floor of the cabin was in its old spot in anticipation of all the crowds that were going to be in here. I remember crawling under there was a little crawl space under the cabin, and we crawled under there with Joyce, secured them up underneath. We did all kinds of work to get it secured for the bicentennial. And then fast forward to 88, 89, and we did the restoration here. I worked on the restoration. We bid on it. It was up for bids. It was kind of interesting bid operation. The pre-bid meeting, there was 5 or 6 prospective contractors, and it was to be open at a certain time, the bids, at a public meeting with the supervisors. And we were the only one that submitted a bid the first time. And I was kind of mad because they opened a bid and it ended up in the paper. But then they threw the bid out and reopened the bids up. So everybody knew what our bid price was. I was really agitated. So when we submitted our bid, and we were the only bidder the second time. And so we got the job. I asked a couple of the guys that I knew that were bidding on it why they didn't bid. And they said it was too scary. They said that's the kind of job that separates the men from the boys. And one guy said to me, I guess you're the man and I'm the boy, because I was too afraid to do that job. So we started, I guess it was in March, and I remember they had moved the cabin, the Historic Society or Commission had raised the money to have the cabin moved. And they had these, some of you probably remember the cute little paper.
There's one upstairs.
Is there one? Okay, whether you put your money in at different locations around town. Anyways, we started in March. It had been moved, and it was sitting precariously leaning that way towards the hole that was still there. It hadn't been filled yet, and on rotten and missing logs. And it was the spring of the year. It wasn't like this March. It was getting warmer. We'd had, I guess, a cold winter, so everything was mud. And I set up my transit to get shoot points on the cabin so that we could jack the cabin up to the right height to start replacing the logs underneath. And every evening, or at the end of the day, when we'd get done, the tripod that my transit was sitting on would be like this or like this because it would sink in the mud. It got so bad, we literally had 5 pounds of mud. You'd be walking like this in the mud. So finally, the last day we had the logs replaced, and I go back there to shoot my points, and transit again is like this, and the cabin is sitting there, and it's jacked up in the air, and it's I said to the guys, that's it, we're going to lower the cabin, we're done. So we lowered it, and it's still in that position right here where we lowered it to back then. Then we started the actual restoration, and like that wall, the east wall, we replaced I think most of the logs. I'd have to go outside to look at the ends. On the east walls of a lot of buildings, whether they be stone, log, or frame, because it doesn't get a lot of sun, you get a lot of the rot. Like on pointed stone houses, the pointing will come out on the east wall before it comes out on the rest of the building. So that wall, the logs were the most deplorable condition. And then on this side, we had to replace, here's one we replaced. And of course, some of the bottom ones all the way around. The floor joist down here we had to replace, and the flooring is new, or replaced. That's, most of the upstairs is original. You see, you might have some pictures where the flooring's all torn up. The flooring that we replaced down here came from the, I think this is the flooring. See, I'm starting to forget things already. That's why I want to do this now before I get even more senile. Any flooring that we replaced, which is possibly the whole first floor, came out of the Thomas house down in Exton, the brick house. They were renovating at the time. I say renovating. They had basically gutted it to the brick walls and tore everything out of it. The only thing left of that house is the brick walls. And I knew the contractor, and he sold us some of the flooring that we used in here, which we thought was kind of neat because not only does it look old, but it's historic. You know, it was just down the road a little ways. It's not of the period of the cabin, but it's antique flooring. So it looks like it's always been here, and it came from the local building. Some of the discoveries that we made was that wall, the doorway in that wall, we put in, as there was one there back in the earlier restoration from the 30s. But what we discovered was the original petition wall, all the boards we found were in a closet that was over here. And when we took them out, they were feather edge like that, and we put them all together, and it was solid wall. There was no door there if you put that wall back the way it was. And how we knew that wall came from there is, I'm just going to kind of walk around here. It was over here. There's a notch in the wall, as you see here. These are all reproductions because the wall is in so bad a shape. But the notch matched this notch that lined up with the mantelpiece there. So we knew that wall came from this room. Plus, if I remember, there were still nail holes in it, and we lined up some of the nail holes in the beam upstairs. So we knew that wall with the feather edging was original, and we also knew from that detail that that there was no way to get from the front room to the back room when that wall was originally put in. Which where we came up with some of the theories about the, I guess when it was a tavern possibly, that one side would have been the tavern area and the other side would have been an area where people lived, possibly. We're not sure why else there was no door in that wall to get from one room to the other. It also kind of might explain why when we discovered this hole in the wall, right there, that stovepipe hole, which has to be original because of the way it snakes up and comes going up into the chimney, is possibly for an early stove to heat that back room with. One of the other things we discovered in doing the restoration was some odd notches that were in the wall over here. On the logs, if you see some of the shelves were sitting on notches that cut out of the logs. And when we lined all them up, it kind of made sense that it would have been a little cupboard built into the wall, just like we rebuilt there. And those notches would have been for holding the shelves. So that was discovered at the same time. And I guess a lot of people know, maybe some don't, why when it was restored, we replaced some of the windows with the smaller windows, and like here and here, and we left some of the bigger windows. The architect, Bob Deslitz, at the time, his decision was to restore it to the oldest known photograph or picture that we had of the place, which I think is some of those early postcards.
Is it that, well,
It might be. There's some postcards that show like at the turn of the century, and because that we know what it looked like at that point from photographs. So, and it was restored to that look, which includes some of the later windows and some of the newer windows. The only thing that wasn't in a postcard, of course, is the back wall, and that's where we discovered that little, as I call it, the trade window. What was there was a big picture window, if I remember, cut out of the logs. I call it a picture window. It was a big, huge window.
yeah, you can see it.
And when we took that out, we found that little notch, and one of the side jambs of that little window with a rosehead nail in it. That might still be around. I'm not sure. I know after we did the restoration, they saved a lot of artifacts, and they were kept down the basement. And they went through like 3 floods until they were so rotted. I got a call one day from somebody from the society, and they asked if they could have my permission to throw everything out because it was so disgusting and moldy and rotting, and I said sure. So a lot of things were lost that were down in the basement. But anyways, we discovered that little window. Now whether it had a glass panes in it, we don't know. It could have just had a shutter board on it, and for what its use was, we're not sure. We call it a trade window because of the little trapdoor up above, and when they did the archaeology, they found some glass trade beads outside that corner. You know, the turquoise trade beads, Indian glass trade beads. So because of that, we kind of call it, and there's some, and Jane Davidson gave me what for this, because I told a reporter and it got in the press. And it was in the paper, and she said, "You don't know for sure, you should have told him that." I said, "Well, you know, what are you going to say?" It's already in the press. There's a restored trading post out in the west somewhere, an Indian trading post, and it has a trade window in it like that, because I know from a fact that if, I don't know for sure this was a trading post, but if it was, you didn't necessarily let Indians into your store because they would just start lifting things and walking out with them, and they'd all come in masses, and so you would try to trade with them outside where you kept your things. So that's what Jane got mad about. So I sent it to the reporter. It was kind of like the drive-through window up at McDonald's. They would come through, and then they put that in there, and Jane Davidson called me, "What'd you say that for?"
And you say that, and we jokingly tell the kids that come in when they say trade window. That's how we put
Because
it.
they don't
That
even
it's
know
the
what
first
else, what
drive-through,
you're
we're
talking
better than
about,
McDonald's.
Another thing was upstairs, which you, I don't know if you've ever seen it up in the attic, way upstairs, is this big truss, of which I have some pictures of that I'm going to give you. And that was put in, Bob Deslitz designed this truss to support the second floor because of there's no center beam, and especially in the back, you have these straight long joists, which we replaced a few of them in the back. Here's one that we did, there was some that were cracked pretty bad like this, so we put these steel plates on them. And there's one or two, I think, in the back, or maybe one that we replaced because it was really rotted. But then this truss upstairs, it's huge, big oak truss. It was a bear to get up to the way up in the attic, and it has cables that come down, which you've probably seen, that help support the floor in the back. And that was Bob Deslitz's design to do that. Trying to think what else to say. Oh, and when we took the mantelpiece off because there was thought that possibly the mantelpiece wasn't original, but when we took it off, and I don't know if there's ever any pictures we're taking this, but the lintel back here was not discolored. It was like it would look if you covered it up originally and it never got discolored or patina on it. So that's why we put this back, because we feel it was original. But when we took it off, all this stuff kind of filtered out from behind it, which I'm sure you have somewhere. There was all kinds of artifacts. One of them was an Indian arrowhead, a quartz arrowhead, that I used to joke about that somebody probably found and set it up here to preserve it, and it fell behind the mantel and they never found it. Probably accused their kids or somebody of stealing it. I remember there was some fish hooks that fell out from back there. The hearth's an interesting story. Before it was moved, if anybody remembers, when it was the Chamber of Commerce office, it had a stone hearth. And Bob Deslitz, the architect, who was a real nice guy, I had worked for him when I worked for John Milner in the early 70s, or worked with him. He decided he wanted what they call a mud clay hearth, or a lime mortar hearth, put in, which is basically just pouring cement. So this friends group with the Historic Society they didn't really want that. They wanted me to find out from him why he wanted that. So that's why a lot of architects don't like me. So one day it was he and I were standing here, and I asked him for his precedent. I said, "Where did you get the precedent for this lime mortar hearth?" I said, "Is there other buildings in the area? Did you see, some evidence that we didn't see?" And he kept saying, "Well, because he wanted it, and he wanted it." And finally, he said, "I'm the blank architect, and you do what I say." So I went back to the group, and I said, "This is what he said." So they said, "No problem, just pour the cement, and we'll have it torn out in a year or so and put the stone in." So that's why you see the stone here. Because it looked ugly. It looked like a poured cement floor is what it looked like. So that explains why the heart's here. Let's see, what else? Trying to think what else we discovered. Do you have any questions?
I have some questions
Sure, go
about
ahead.
the upstairs.
Okay, yeah, we haven't been up there yet. I have some stuff to talk about up there too. And it's safe to go up there with all of us because there's that support.
I don't know.
Not all at once,
No, it's still not that safe.
no.
Yeah,
We
what
have
kind
to
of-
space ourselves way out.
What kind of wood is it?
Most of the logs are oak, probably
Yeah,
different
that's what I
species
thought.
of oak, but I've had people say, oh, they build them out of white oak. No, you're out in the wilderness. You know you want it to be oak because it's a hardwood. And so you just cut down all the oak trees. You don't go, well, I just want that tree because it's white oak and that one because it's white oak. And, one of the things I said at the grand opening, when they had the opening here and all the speechifying and all the ceremonies, I gave my little speech, and I was kind of interested at the time. The paper mill was still in operation across the street, and there were days that we worked here that was real humid and damp, and the mist from the paper mill, and it was just disgusting. And you'd get a sore throat. I'd tell everybody to leave early. We'd leave at like 2 o'clock or something because all the guys were back. So when I gave my speech, I talked about when the cabin was built, there was the musky smells of the frontier wilderness, and versus today we have the musky smells of the of the paper mill across the street, which isn't there anymore. But let me think. Oh, I know what else. In the back, let's go back to the back room. That's right. When we were doing the restoration, I'm not sure what prompted me to do this, was tapping on the wall. I guess I was tapping to see if any of the plaster was loose. And all of a sudden I hear this hollow, dunk, 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 and it's this hollow sound. So I chipped away and found this little niche that had been covered up for who knows how many, 100 years or more. And the neatest thing about it was that we found that burn mark up there. So somebody, one time like there, had a candle in here that burned a little spot in the top. So that was discovered during the restoration also. Had been closed in for what reason, I don't know, years and years before. Oh, there's some more of the plates we put in to secure the joists. And maybe we did replace joists down here. Maybe we just did that. I look up here and I see that. Maybe we just did all the plates to secure them. Trying to think, there was anybody that wasn't here before the restoration. There used to be a bathroom under the steps with this seat on the toilet that would scare the daylights out of you. When you got up, the toilet automatically flushed. You'd jump out the little window out front. It was something from the 30s, I think. It was real ancient. But that disappeared with the restoration.
If there was not a door there, and possibly for the tavern, then how do people get to the second floor since the stairs are on the other
Well,
side?
we're not sure, again, we're not sure how that worked because, first off, that's the other thing, we don't know. It's funny that on the lower Swedish cabin I'm doing some work on right now, we're going to rebuild the stairs. And we've been talking about putting the stairs that were in there were like 1840s. And we were talking about putting a loft ladder in, but we're probably going to put back the 1840 stairs because it's the only steps that we know for sure were there. And it's the same thing here. We're not positive that those are the original steps. I remember talking about that with Bob, but they were there, so we left them. Was there a loft ladder, and did it enter from this side? Did it enter from over there? Was it between the joists somewhere? We're not sure. Or are they the original location of the steps? I forget what reasons led us to believe they possibly weren't the original steps.
Well, in the
There
early
might have been a loft ladder there
Early
or something.
70s, Ashbridge is 1709, and
Mhm.
those steps are like a spiral
The
going up
wires,
to
yeah.
and then when they added on and the Federalist trees coming in, they're much
Put the
wider
nicer
and
big
whatever.
ones in here.
So since this is about 1716,
Yeah.
I was,
I'm not sure, and again, I don't remember everything, it's been so many years ago, but I vaguely remember talking about if the steps were original. Now, not original in that location, but original the way they're built, was it a loft ladder? When I say loft ladder, it's like real steep steps. It's like two boards with treads down to it that's usually pretty steep, and it saves a little bit more space than the regular set of steps.
now when you say the bathroom, was it where the cellar door is?
Yes, it was. We went in that door, and there was a little toilet and a sink in there.
Because one of the Bogs were in here, and they said one of their relatives had said it was one of those pool tank flushes, that the tank is on
Might have been
top.
at one time. I know the one that was there, because one of the bicentennial, when I was in here working alone one night, I had to use it. And like I say, when I got up, I almost jumped out the front window. And there was these little, I don't even think they still make, they're kind of neat. There's a little spring thing on the seat. When you sat down, it was fine. When you got up, it flushed the toilet.
You know, when I was a little girl, I used one in my grandmother's outhouse, and she wouldn't let us go. She wouldn't let me go back in the house. She wanted to be able to see me, and I'd cry every time. Do I have to use this one? Because I was so little that I was afraid that I was going to go down the hall.
He gets sucked down there when it came on. Thank you. Let me look at these pictures quick and see what else is. Oh, it was interesting in the jacking. You can see some of the pictures of jacking. We, when we did the actual jacking, to keep it level, this is, of course, this is when they moved it. This is our jacks, but we had to jack everything equally. Which again, like I said, when the building was, when we first started, it was sitting, kind of leaning like this, sitting on the foundation with missing logs at the bottom. So we had to jack it up level and then jack it up straight like that. And that's what was such a pain because, you know, with the mud, and even the jacking stations would settle in the mud and the building would kind of move every day. But in order to jack a building like this, you literally have to have enough guys on each corner, at least 2 guys, because you have the jacks would come out that way and inside. So you need to have 1 guy inside, 2 guys outside on each corner, and they all have to jack together to get it to come up equal. You don't want the building to come up crooked. So it was kind of a challenge with the mud in the ground. When we did the first actual work on the building, you can kind of see here where it was just sitting on some rotten logs, and they had some piers to hold it up till we got there. And you can see it was in a hole. So that last day when it started to lean again, because we had it jacked up above the replaced logs as well, I said, let's put it down and let's be done.
Was this built as a 2-story, or was this upstairs added later?
I think it was all built together. What was the other thing that was interesting with this cabin? The slideshow that we used to give was called The Tale of 2 Cabins, and it was basically this cabin and the Swedish cabin in Upper Darby, or Clifton Heights. It was built around 1650, a few years earlier than this. But there were a lot of comparisons with the east end of that cabin had a lot more damage than because of the weathering. And just like this cabin, the west gable had the original siding, and so did that cabin. Has the original siding on the west gable, because again, it didn't get all the weathering, so it lasted longer. So you've got original gable siding here, and I don't think it's original over here. I'd have to look outside, but I think we replaced this side. One day when the masons were working on the chimney, and everybody had left, I guess it was 4:30, 4:45, and I was inspecting everything, so I climbed the mason scaffolding to go up and look at the chimney. And a lot of masons, they're notorious for not building really good scaffolds. And I get up on the scaffold, I go to come down, and the whole scaffold goes like this. I'm like, ooh. So I scurry back to the top, and I'm sitting there, and it's rush hour, and cars are going by, and they're tooting and waving. And then, should I call for help? And I thought, well, how embarrassing is that going to be? So since it was leaning this way, it finally dawned on me, well, if I go down the other side, it'll stabilize it. So I did, after about 20 minutes of sitting up there waving to everybody going by.
Is that cabin in Upper Darby still in existence?
Yeah, I was just there, Friday, right, Thursday. I reconstructed a smokehouse for that, log smokehouse. And last summer in July, a tree fell and flattened the roof on it, so the insurance from the township's paying me to rebuild the roof, which was kind of sad. They were so excited about their smokehouse, and this roof literally went, it broke all the rafters, and it broke one of the logs on the top and cracked another one.
How long did this project take?
This project, if I remember, it took, I would venture to say, I don't remember exactly, because I think there was a delay. What happened was the Friends group, or whoever it was at the time that raised the money for the restoration and the moving of it, I kind of understand they probably got burned out. If there's anybody around from back then, tell me I'm full of crap if you want to. They probably got burned out because they raised over $100,000 to move it, which was a lot of money back in the 80s. Still a lot. So the deal was with Downingtown was they would have raised the rest of the money for our restoration, because there was to be no taxpayer money spent on it. Well, they kind of burned out and they weren't raising any money, so there was all these meetings that were kind of high-spirited with us and the Friends group and the Borough Council and Don Greenleaf. And eventually what happened was the Borough of Downingtown paid for us to do the work, and the Friends group was to reimburse them. Whether they ever did or not, I don't know. But there was a couple delays because they ran out of money, and then we had these meetings, and I know Wesley and I had to go to the Borough Council meetings to tell them what we've done and how much has been spent and how much more there is to go yet. So I want to say it took maybe 9 months, something like that.
I had heard that these logs that you have to replace,
you can't just go cut a tree down and use
You
the log.
you should use standing dead oak. And what happened at the time, there had been that epidemic of gypsy moth beetles that had killed a lot of oak trees. So we found some loggers that were cutting down standing dead oak, which was standing dead, but doesn't mean it necessarily was as dry as it could be. Because if I remember, I know at the Swedish cabin, I'm not sure if that happened here, we did another log cabin at about the same period over in Thornton, Delaware County. It was round logs, an early cabin. And they had the same problem. The logs, even though they were dead, they still shrank. And what happens when they shrink is the chinking tends to want to fall out. This is what, historically, this was the problem with a log house like this, and why they used to have to chink them a lot. And if they didn't, there's accounts of people in the frontier, which this would have been the frontier, staying in these log cabins on the frontier and complaining about the wind and the snow blowing through and all the bugs. One of the things I think the guy said, the mosquitoes were pesky last night, because places were literally wide open because the chinking kept falling out, because they would use green logs back then. Of course, they couldn't wait for the logs to dry. And I know the house in Thornton, it had the stone pointed chinking between the logs, and the same thing at the Swedish cabin on the east pen has stone pointed chinking. And I had to replace on both cabins a couple of the days of chinking, because they literally, the log shrank so much you could stick your finger in between the log and the chinking.
That's exactly what
That's
happened right
probably
here. You
what's-
can,
yeah.
before I could only get up to my first knuckle in, but now
Okay.
I can get almost my whole fingers in.
Now, when they did the maintenance re-restoration a few years ago, and they replaced some logs, did they use dead oak logs then, or, do you remember?
I know.
I always wanted to stop and talk to the guy.
Yeah, I know they
told
told us it had to be 60-year-old
Mhm.
hardwood, and what they did was they cut the one log in half
Wow.
and spliced it on the outside, so, because this side was fine, so they took it back as far as they could, and then fit it in there.
That's another problem I've encountered over the years with log houses. I prefer to restore hewn log houses because you can buy 200-year-old hewn logs from houses and barns that were torn down. Whereas with the round logs, you can't. And again, the house in Thornton and also the Swedish cabin had this problem. Because they're new oak logs, and it's wood, you don't know the nature of a piece of wood. I've actually had to replace trim that's only a couple of years old. Like around the window, this piece is rotted, but the rest is fine because it was just a bad piece of wood. And I remember when they were replacing that log, and I thought, I wonder if that log went bad. And I know what happened at the other two round log houses, where one of the logs went bad, because it was just a bad log. But you don't know, how do you know that when it's not
Well,
rotted when you put it in.
At that time, most of the whitewash had gone off too, and when they had it inspected, they found that the water was coming through on this side.
That's what's right.
Yeah, so I know they had the logs laying in here when they were doing it.
Oh, that's another thing, speaking of whitewash, that was an interesting episode. Don Greenleaf's nephew was the painter, I forget his name. Anyways, he did the painting here and the whitewashing. And the reason the cabin was whitewashed, again, in those early pictures, it's whitewashed, but also on the outside, we had to do a lot of epoxy, a lot of caulk, because a lot of the logs were really weathered, really bad, and they were, really bad. I mean, you could put your finger in the little grooves. So we had to do a lot of that, which is ugly. So the whitewash accomplished two things. It gave it the appearance of the earliest pictures, plus it covered over all the ugliness when we had to do epoxying, plus it helps protect the logs. But when we did that, because this cabin was restored, I keep saying cabin, I'm not at the Swedish cabin, that is a cabin, it doesn't have a foundation, this was a log house. Because it had been the brown, well, they didn't even have white chinking on it back in the 30s up to the when we restored it. It was just like a grayish brown cement chinking. But people had gotten used to that, as I call it, the John Wayne look, the cowboy look, I guess. So there was all kinds of nastiness when we whitewashed it, to the point that the Coachville Record wrote some nasty things in the paper. But the worst was the painter and I were here one day alone, and people were sitting in traffic out there hollering up, like well-dressed business ladies and businessmen hollering things I won't repeat. So Peter was his name. So finally I said to Peter, I said, we better shut and lock that gate before somebody comes in here and tries to hit us. I mean, people were we had people walking up and down the sidewalk hollering at us, like, what did we do?
I still get comments about
Yeah.
it, that it looks like an ice box and
But
things of that
most
nature.
early houses, when they had the ability to do that, as I explained to people, the Swedish cabin we whitewashed just like inside here, it's white between the logs. Watson in the Annals of Pennsylvania has a chapter in there, it was a book written in the 1840s on Schaefferstown. And I'm not sure where he gets this terminology from, but he went to Schaefferstown, there were a lot of log buildings in Schaefferstown, dramatic log buildings, and he claims that they looked like Wilmington stripes is his exact terminology. I'm not sure where he gets that. And what he meant by that was this look, where they were whitewashing, lime washing between the logs to protect the chinky. And I figure, and then, what's his name? Johann Reising, the final governor of New Sweden in the 1650s. In his report back to Queen Christina, he reports finding an area, not sure if it was in Delaware today or Chester, Delaware County, but an area of kale and clay, and he calls the clay white enough to whiten our buildings with. So whiten our buildings meaning whitewash inside or outside. So it's always been my contention is, and you do see when people actually study the layers of whitewash, there's usually more whitewash between the logs than on the logs. And on the logs could be for two reasons, as we know here, it falls off the logs easier than it does off the cement or masonry. But also because I think originally they would have whitewashed between the logs, and it was to protect the chinking, which is nothing more than clay and straw back then. And like I said earlier, it would fall out all the time, and rain would hit it with weather. It was adobe. So in order to protect that, just like you do with plaster, you do a white coat on top. So they would do the lime wash on it. And I think at the point, and I'm not sure when, but either because they got tired of being neat and not sloppy on the logs, or when it got to that point where it's fashionable to whitewash your stone houses is when they started to whitewash log buildings because it looked more fashionable. Plus, it also would have maybe protected the logs a little bit. There was a time, and I remember growing up, and it goes back to the 18th century, when they used to lime wash the bottoms of fruit trees to keep bugs from getting in the fruit trees. So that could have been another reason they whitewashed outside. I know they whitewashed inside a lot because it made it brighter. Because originally, like if this window wasn't here, it was just that little window, it'd be dark in here. I did log house in Bethel Township, Delaware County. It's the oldest house in the township for a fellow that took it down years ago to save it and had me put it up back in the late 90s. And he allowed me to actually whitewash the room with the cooking fireplace in it and whitewash the ceiling and the walls so it looked more authentic. I call it Schaefer's Follies. It's just a little museum house on his property. He has it fully furnished, and he's a member. I think he's the chairman of the Bethel Township Historic Commission. That's their place where they have their meetings. But that's basically it. We can go upstairs and look around, and we can talk about stuff.
That's my question.
I'm trying to remember why we moved them.
That
There's
has,
a reason all this was done, and I don't. This is why architects should write things down. I don't know if Bob ever did a after restoration report or not.
we do have a booklet with, you know, a few of the drawings, what was found, where the well would have been, and, you know, the post
Oh, is that the little
holes and
book
things
that,
like that.
the guy that glued all the pottery together did?
No,
Okay.
this would have been from the archaeology company.
Oh, okay, from the archaeologist.
And I
yeah.
have it at home, and I should have brought it today, but that's what I get for staying up late last night. But I have scoured that book for information about this.
I'm trying to remember why we moved the
Why
walls.
that one's there, that one's not,
Yeah.
and right, there was another one here.
That was a door right here, I remember that, just like it is now.
Right, it just would have
So
come
why
out a
did we
little
move
bit
it there?
further.
Shoot. I remember moving all this stuff and discovering that those were the original petition, you know, where there would have been.
But at some point, they came out a little bit further.
Yeah. Then why did we leave this cleat here?
And was this one here, and then deteriorated, or did somebody take it off in the meantime? That, you know, it got loose.
He doesn't talk about
So
that,
not being
that little
attributed
booklet,
to-
that, what's his name? I can never remember his name, that he wrote. Does he say anything in there?
Harlan
Was that the,
Morrison.
I was gonna say, what was his name?
Harlan Morrison.
Oh, Harlan, yes.
Yeah.
He interviewed me, and that was years ago, and I remembered more. And
I have
wonder if-
books. I have the books.
Yeah, I have the book at home too. I have to look in there.
I feel like I've skimmed through that
We're
one.
talking
I-
that little book, The Way It Was, or something like that?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
Written by Rex.
Yeah.
Harlan Morrison, yeah. Yeah, he used to come up here and sit by himself and glue all the shards together. He was a chain smoker.
Yep, that's
And somebody
Yeah.
told him he couldn't smoke here anymore. He said, "Screw you," and that was the end of that. He left. I said, "So why don't you go outside? It's nice. Take everything outside." Oh, the hell with them.
He also, from what we
Appreciate it.
gathered, he had a lot of extension cords up here,
Did
just
he?
daisy chained and daisy
Oh,
chained.
yes,
and
he
they
had all
got
these
to be
lights,
yeah,
yeah.
they got to be a little bit of a
It was
fire
his personal
hazard.
laboratory up here. Although he did glue a lot of stuff
Yeah,
together.
and we're thankful for that. He did a
He
nice
actually
job.
wanted to continue the digs because a lot of this stuff, which is probably right, he figured we could find more of the pieces to put back in but the digs never progressed any further. Oh, there it is.
Yeah, there it
That
is.
one, except it fell apart.
We have one downstairs that we use for donations. It sits on top of the donation jug and gets people its
See, they had them all over
attention.
town and people would leave money on them.
This is one of the better shape. I think this might be the last good shape one.
If they ever need a pristine one, we have a pristine one.
Do you have it?
Because it was the Historical Society that ran the campaign.
Now, here was a sad story, the Pollock's Mill. When I was on the Historic Commission, Dan Tavis owned that. And it looked like that. I mean, you could still go in it, it had the mill wheel in it still.
Yep.
So we approached him about would he be interested in selling it or donating it to the borough so we could restore it. He wasn't. But we somehow he came to the conclusion that we could cut the trees down around it that were growing right up to it, and we could board it up to secure it, which we did. We spent 2 or 3 weekends. It was Wayne Hurt, Phil, and me, and I think Dick Radcliffe. And we cleared the trees and we boarded up the windows to no avail because you see what it is now. And Tavis just let it fall down. That was sad.
I was over there recently, poked my head in, looked down, and the equipment's still there.
I know, it's-
They spent a lot of money
Frustrating.
stabilizing those walls.
Yeah, they did. But which is kind of good, except what's happening around there. Don't even start me about that. But back then it had the roof on it, and like I say, it had the millstones were in there. What kind of upset me in a way, but it didn't. The old steel mill next door, what's his name? Pollock. I forget his name that had it. He went in there one time and took out. They always have these cranes that you can pick up the millstones with, and it was still there. And he took it out and he put it out along 322 to hold his sign, which it was, and it looked neat. And like his point to me was, I said something to him. He said, "Well, it was just going to rot in there." Well, it rotted eventually out there holding his sign, which was kind of sad. But yeah, it's too bad. But well, when that house across the street from it, the old inn, got torn down, I was one of the many people, I guess, that used to go over there and root around in the piles. And I found, because one of the reports was, oh, it isn't that old, that's why we're letting them tear it down. I found some beams that still had the hand split lath on it, plaster lath with rose head nails. And I'd always been told when I was on the Historic Commission that I think it was the left side was really early, like 1720s or 30s or something like that, maybe even as late as the 50s, but I still think that was an early building.
I was talking about the structure that was directly across
Across
from
from
the
the
mill,
mill, yeah.
where the Pollocks live, yeah, and
All right, Jack.
Um,
Have a good day, man.
June LaDrew did some research, and that was possibly the Webb Tavern.
Yeah, because
After the Revolution.
when I was on the Historic Commission, we were always told it was a tavern.
There are pictures of that.
It's the old
And
grocery
he's
store.
got some maps, because he did it in one of the newsletters.
We had actually had some dreams back when we were on the Historic Commission of seeing that someday restored, the old horseshoe trail, and there's the mill and the tavern and the mill house, restoring all that and making it like a little colonial area for Downingtown. Never happened, but because at the time Tavis owned it, wasn't the least bit interested in selling anything. But that would have made such a great little historic area, museum area. But, well, now it's all gone. Except for some 1840s house that is not
Right.
historic and that wasn't even restored. But now, as we're talking, I'm trying to think why this wall was moved. It's a game for the life of me. I'm gonna have to go home and look at Harlan's book and try to remember.
He wrote 2 books. Maybe
That's
this is,
right, he did.
this is not a fair thing to ask you, but I'm gonna ask you since I've seen both of them and have read them actually.
Go ahead.
He's convinced, he became convinced that the cabin was not built as early as they all thought
Yeah,
it was in the
I
beginning.
disagree
and-
with him on that.
And his, reasoning was, that a lot of the logs in the wood actually showed signs of a circular saw, which didn't get here till 1740.
Never saw that. You know, I disagree with him totally on that. We had a couple heated debates up here one day about that.
Okay, well.
When he first came up with that suggestion, that idea. I think it's as early as they claim, you know, first quarter of the 18th century. I don't know, there's always people that see into things, I suppose. The Swedish cabin, which we had dendrochronology done on before it was restored. The dendrochronology didn't come out 100% because there was some pollution on some of the logs, but the ones that did come out good claimed that the cabin, that's where we get the 1650, that the logs were cut around 1650. So the Friends group always uses that as the date. It wouldn't hold up in a court of law because all the logs tested didn't come out because some of them were polluted. But there were naysayers, there's still naysayers, that says that the Swedish cabin didn't survive the flood of 1848, like they should know if they were there or something. And it's always been my contention that in 1962, we had the great storms in the Jersey Shore, everything didn't get wiped out. Every building on every island didn't get wiped out. We had Hurricane Agnes, everything down the creeks didn't get wiped out. So what actually proved my point was in 1999, we had Hurricane Floyd. There was 4 feet of water in the Swedish cabin, and according to the press, that was worse. This was in the paper. It was worse than the flood of 1848. Cabin's still there. So there's always naysayers that you know, that think something because they've read into something that think it's not as old as it is, or maybe that, in my point, maybe it's older than it is.
The logic is
but
that if this was not absolutely all original, that there was something here with Thomas More, because he started the mill.
Mhm.
And in 1717, and as the Lancaster Road is starting to go, he petitions for House of Public Entertainment, and he wanted to be able to sell liquor. So there's obviously something right here.
Yeah. That's why, again, all the evidence I saw in the building, we're doing the work, the looks of the construction of it, and just the way it's built, everything tells me first quarter of the 18th century. It's I hate to use this word, it's got that crude look to it. It's not a finished, refined look. It looks like a frontier building that you'd see when this was the end of the civilized world at the edge of the wilderness, at the end of the road.
Are you familiar with Joseph Plum Martin's
Martin?
book?
I'm familiar with it, yeah. I haven't read it, but I'm familiar with it.
He writes in it about being in Milltown and staying at a log house for a little while and getting some supplies in it.
Okay.
Most of us speculate that he was talking about this building,
Could
but
be.
we're not really sure.
Well, I know that, and this is something I'd love to see more of a study done on. I've been on enough organizations that I know to keep my mouth shut, because when you say this, everybody looks at you and goes, go ahead and do it. Is in the Revolutionary War in Downingtown, when it was a supply bastion and there were troops stationed here. And I'm sure that, that's when Joseph Plum Martin was probably here. It's possible he was with those troops that were here stationed in town and maybe staying at the end, I'm not sure.
Well, he was a young guy, and
Oh, this is
I think-
before the war.
No, it
during
was
the war.
during the war.
Okay.
He was in for the entire duration of the
Yeah.
war. He was from Connecticut, and when Washington was in Valley Forge, him being the kid,
Mhm.
he was sent out to forage, instead
Okay.
of putting him like in the possible harm's way, and so he came out here and stayed here somewhere.
There were actually a fair number of log houses. If you look at the
Yeah.
glass tax of 1798, there were scattered all
Yep.
over the place,
Yeah.
log houses. So it might be this one, but it could also have been a whole lot.
And does he
of
say
them.
it was an inn that he stayed at, or he just stayed at a log house?
I don't recall it.
If he doesn't say an inn, I mean, it could have been any, but it could have been this one,
Well, you said he was getting supplies, and by the time, there are little stores that are
Yeah.
coming up,
Yeah.
so. It would be nice, but I don't know that this
Yeah,
was
unless
used
there's a diary
as, I don't think this was used as a store in the Revolution. It was owned by the Downings. He bought it in the 1740s. And it was clearly owned by the Downings, but they rented it out by, basically, from my understanding, as residences for people. And he moved his store down into the complex.
And by the 1770s, Downingtown was a pretty sophisticated town versus what it would have been when this was built,
Yeah.
when it would have been a town on the frontier. It's always intriguing to talk to people about the frontier and how it moved. The Swedish cabin days, that was the frontier, Upper Darby, Springfield, and it kept moving west. And by the early 18th century, it was here, and there were just traders going west, out to Conestoga and the Susquehannock areas. And that even changed. I mean, the Swedes would be going to the Susquehannocks and the Dutch, and then by the time of this period, you had people were going to the Conestoga Indians and even further west. And then the frontier moved further and further west till it ended up, California. We saw the Pacific Ocean.
I've seen it, maybe not frontier, but I've seen a lot of changes as to what used to be rural isn't rural anymore.
Oh, yes.
I mean,
I know what the Scotch Irishmen felt like when they kept wanting to move away from all this crap. When I first moved to Hollis Township in the 1970s, it was all farms. I don't think there's any farms left there now. And the farmer planted corn last year and it came up houses. It's terrible. And now that the good times are getting back to the way they should be, there's more developments happening up that way, up on Little Conestoga by the Turnpike, and it's like, oh, here we go again. It's like, when will this ever stop?
yeah.
It's kind of sad, but I know what the Scotch Irishmen felt like when they kept moving to get away from civilization. They'd see their neighborhood go down the tubes because somebody else was building another house. But it is sad when it happens. And in our day and age, what happens is we lose our history. Because most people, it's funny, during the bicentennial, I thought, well, things are going to change now. People are going to appreciate history. We won't have all this wanton destruction. Well, it might have changed for a year or two, and after that, it hasn't changed.
Yeah, right down there by the old Roger Hunt Mill. I mean, there's a row of townhouses right on Race
Yeah.
Street there, and
So horrible.
we think they covered up a Revolutionary War readout there, So
Oh, good. I want to talk to you about that. When I went out there before they built it, I'm looking for the readout. I'm out in the swamps. I'm all over the place. And I had my brother-in-law, Dick Nelms, ask around where that supposedly was, because it was in the paper. They wanted the developer to save that. So he said where it was, and so we went and found it. And we looked at it, and it looked to me like a pile of dirt that was put there by a bulldozer. Don Greenleaf used to tell me that, and you have to ask him if you see him, that the Cannon readout was out. It was out. He's not sure if it disappeared when they put in the bypass, but it was out around the bypass somewhere. And I always wanted to get on the other side of the bypass before they built over there to look around, but I never did. But he had always been told, I don't know if he told me he saw it or not, that it was up that way. So I'm not sure if this was another one that was down by the Pollock's Mill. I never heard of that until the article was in the paper about that one. That's why I went out there to root around and look.
I'm gonna muddy this even more. There's a guy at Valley Forge that was doing all kinds of work. This is in the last 20 years, because he had all the equipment and
Mhm.
stuff and that. And he came out and connected it with the thing at Valley Forge, and his conclusion is that that's not where it was. It was actually out kind of where Shanahan was, because of.
That's about, like where Don Green, Shanahan. Oh, no, I'm thinking the high school, Shanahan.
Because of the
Okay.
transportation on the road
That's
and
true.
the inn and he found other stuff out there.
was that on Graham Miles's property there, or on the Shanahan property?
No, it wasn't on the Brown property. It was the stuff after that, which was, and I can't remember who the big farm was, but that would have been open fields. And,
But now, why would it have been so far off the main road?
well, that was the main road. That's Lancaster Avenue.
Oh, well, I'm thinking where the high school is now. It's way back there, Shanahan.
Right, now I'm thinking about on Lancaster Road and those fields.
Towards closer, okay, I know what you
And the
mean.
fact that you had
Towards-
an inn, gave you access to things,
Yeah.
and,
Up by the,
there's a diary in the back of Bodo Otto's book.
Whose?
Bodo Otto's, who ran Yellow
Doctor.
Springs Hospital,
Oh,
and,
okay.
the doctor with a weird name.
and talked about this itinerant preacher, and he was ministering to the soldiers that were in the upper part of the barn at Joseph Downing's, which is also right out there. And the preacher that did this stayed with Dr. Smith, and they were at the inn and whatever, and it just kind of, it kind of
Yeah,
made
makes
sense
sense.
in terms of that.
That's true. There was another project that, I don't know if you remember that article, that I wrote a letter to the editor back when they were building the Home Depot shopping center. about why they didn't do some kind of archaeology to look for the supposed graves that were. I'd been told for years that there were graves there, and I used to go out there when they were bulldozing and looking. I was praying one day. I said, "Please let me find some human bones so I can stop this
Actually,
development."
my
Yeah.
husband,
But I never
husband did a
did.
lot of that, and the graves would have been where Bell Tavern Park is. They
Yeah.
kind of found where the barn was and whatever, and.
Well, the barn used to. Wayne Hurt had me to the barn right after it burnt back in the '70s, and there's pictures of it in. There's a painting of it in. I think it's Bernie Ball's book on barns at Chester County. Somebody
Okay,
did a painting.
which barn, the Ashbridge
The,
barn or the Downing barn?
Downing barn, which
Okay.
was supposed. Now it's funny when after I did that, was it that? No, even earlier. This was interesting. Back in the '80s, I guess, I wanted to try to find the graves. I talked to Don, and I said, Don, if I can find these graves, can we put them somewhere? And Don said, up where the triangle is there. He said, we could put them there and get a memorial stone for them if we could find them. So I thought, how am I going to find these graves? So I went to the Paris Study House down in Chester Heights to see about people that are gifted. And I thought the guy was a nutcase, so I kind of backed off of that. But I also did some research, and I found out that if you do look for bodies, even if they're 200 years old, you have to have an archaeologist, you have to have a undertaker, or the county coroner. It's really involved. And then I thought, but the one thing the guy said at the Paris Study House, people that are gifted, that can kind of like dowsers look for water. But he said, you can't just say there's 1,000 acres, go look for it. He said, you have to know an area. And the only thing I remembered was I'd always been told that the grassy area in front of the Downingtown Farmers Market was left there because Tabors thought that's where the bodies were. I don't know. And always, like you thought, that if they were in that barn, the Downing barn, they would have been buried nearby. But it was either at that period, and also at that period, I guess there was an article in the paper when I was doing that. I got all these nasty letters from people that said, leave it alone, don't touch these people. And I kind of was thinking, no, they deserve the recognition. They're heroes. They don't leave them there where it's going to be developed.
My husband did some research on that, and they talk about shallow graves, and there was a lot of thinking, and I'm repeating, I don't know, that in the time of the Revolution, a lot of the families came and got their bodies, so that was not the final resting place of a lot of them,
Yeah.
that the families took the bodies and reburied them at home.
Well, what happened was somebody contacted me. He was what's the Ashbridge House? I don't know who the guy's
Probably
name.
Roger Gregson.
It was somebody I'd never heard of, and he wasn't from the area, and I don't know how he got my name, but he was somehow related to Ashbridges or Downings, I forget.
Yeah.
But he said the Ashbridge House barn, which was across the street from the house, was also used as a hospital, and what he had always been told when he grew up there on the farm was that the bodies were buried out by there somewhere. So, which I'd never heard any of that. I knew the Downing barn had been used.
Right, I never heard
So that
about
was
the
new to me,
Ashbridge
and I
barn.
never got back to the guy because at that point I just decided it was too frustrating. How am I going to find these graves? It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. And I thought, well, how am I ever going to do this? I just didn't have the time, to delve into it that much. A kind of interesting story. When Jane, she always on the Wallace Township Historic Commission, which I used to be on too. But after I moved down to Delaware County for 13 years. Before I moved back to Wallace, and while I was down there is when they did the Home Depot development, and my landlord Bonnie and Bill Radford, Bonnie's on the Historic Commission, and I never approached Jane about this because I knew she wouldn't say anything. One night, Bonnie said at the meeting when that was going on, Jane started to talk about they discovered some bones when they were doing excavating, and she just said, "Oh, I've been told I can't talk about this, no more said," and she wouldn't say anything more about it. I think they dug up some bones there. And she was told, I guess, because I was in Jane's living room when she became the county preservation officer, because I worked with Lester, and we were congratulating her, and then I told her it was kind of a dumb job. And she said, "What do you mean a dumb job?" I said, "It's politics." I said, if the county commissioners want to tear down the county courthouse, if you bitch about it, you'll get fired from your job. I said, what you're doing is a great thing, but it's politics. I said, you have to do what the powers to be want you to do. And I think that's what happened there. I think she was told to keep her mouth shut. But she started to say something, and Bonnie said she never said anything more about it. I think they dug up some bones there.
Well, the East, I know, when the Ashbridge House, and Roger was out there fooling around, and the East Callan supervisors let him know, boy, he better not dig anything up that was gonna delay what they wanted to do.
By the way, when I wrote that letter to the editor about doing archaeology and why the township didn't force the developer to do something more there. It ended up taking up the half a page of the editorial section, and I was the chairman of the Edgemont Township Historic Commission at the time. So when I signed it, I signed Norman T. Glass, chairman, Edgemont Township Historic Commission. With a lawyer for the Planning Commission, a guy named Dennis, I forget his last name. I didn't know it, but he was the lawyer for East Callan Township. So at one of the Planning Commission meetings, which I used to always have to attend, he comes up to me and said, "Man, did you piss off those people down there in East Callan?" I said, "I did, but how's that?" He said, "With that letter," he said, "when you signed it, Norman Glass, Edgemont Township," and he said, "they knew I was a lawyer up here," and he said, "they all looked at me and said, 'Who the hell is this guy?'"
When I first started UPS in February of '88, I was working in West Conshohocken. And right now there's the Four Falls Corporate Center, which you can see right off the
Oh yes,
Expressway.
the inn used to be with it.
Yeah, when I first started there, it wasn't built yet, and it was an archaeological dig because they had found some
Other
Indian
people up there.
bones and stuff there, so they had to stop the construction of this, multi-million-dollar building for a couple of years while they excavated it all out. And during the process, there was a husband and wife archaeological team, the Jensens, and she was pregnant, and it was Good Friday of '88. And one of their lay workers went nutso and stabbed the
He was the archaeologist that the Swedish cabin people hired.
The Jensens?
Yeah, he came out and he instructed us. We basically it was volunteers, but he had classes, and that was happening at that point. We were really upset. The guy that did it was
The stabber?
yeah, he was a jailbird that had been in for rape or something, and they would hire these people to give them a chance. And it became controversial because archaeologists are girls, a lot of them with short shorts and they're bent over. Like I've been around many of them,